Good evening, everyone. I'd like to welcome everyone to the shiur for tonight. We're doing it in the Bet Knesset in Or Torah. I just want to thank sponsor for our food tonight, Rachel Shandali. Thank you very much. And of course, I also want to thank Berta and David, since they graciously open up their house every single week almost to our shiur. Today they couldn't do it, so we're doing it in the Bet Knesset instead. May Hashem give them beracha in all that they do, as with our sponsor. Our parasha, I said there are three different types of women our parasha talks about. We've only mentioned two of them. We mentioned the yoledet, and we briefly touched on the nidah. The nidah is not really spoken about in much detail in the Torah. It's very little. But we learn from the others that are mentioned in more detail about the nidah. So what is the nidah? When a woman generally has 7 days of a menstrual cycle. Some women are shorter, some women are a little longer, but it's about 7 days. And during those 7 days, when she's supposed to see bleeding, if she sees bleeding, she's called nidah. And she cannot be with her husband, and there's other kinds of halachot about that. I'm not going to go into details about that. We could potentially do that at another time. How does a person take themselves out of a situation of tum'ah? There is a necessary ingredient that is always needed with vis-a-vis tum'ah. Some of them it's time, right? You have to wait a period of time, okay? Obviously, whatever is causing the tum'ah has to stop. So if the woman is bleeding, the bleeding has to stop, okay? And if the bleeding stops, okay, then, okay, there's the potential for becoming tahor depending on what type of tum'ah is there. We're going to get to guys in a second. This is not discriminatory. A second. Out of all the tum'ot, all of the things that cause tum'ah, how does a person rectify? So some of it requires time, but there's a common ingredient necessary in all of them. What is that ingredient? Water. Some of them, the tum'ah is tied to when the korban is well, but water is the common ingredient throughout all tum'ah, even a tamei met. How does a person become tamei tahor? They go to mikveh, and they also have to have sprinkle of the water from the para aduma. The different tumot are different, but they all require immersion in water. Why is water the vehicle that removes tum'ah?
Because it cleans everything. It's light.
But we just said that there's nothing dirty about a person who is tameh. When you say clean,
it's life. Water is life. It's always given. It's hesed, right?
Okay, so water is life. Torah is life. Etz chaim hi lemachazikim ba. So why can't a woman, when she becomes nidah, let's say she's not around the mikveh, why can't she go and spend the whole day in the Bet Midrash learning Torah, and then she would come to Tahor studying Torah?
I have no
idea. All Tumah and Tara is generally tied to the sin of Adam Harishon. Almost all the time it's related in some way, shape, or form to death or destruction of potential life. When a woman she's nidah, what died? It was an egg. The egg was not fertilized. So therefore that egg died. And then there's bleeding. That causes tumah. So we see a dead body. Why is a dead body the most tameh thing? Because what was the punishment for Adam and Hava? Maybe not a punishment. One could look at that as not as a punishment, but that's a whole separate class. What was the effect of eating from the tree? Death. So therefore, anything that comes and reminds us of death, when we come into contact with death, what naturally happens? There's a reminder of the sin of Adam Harishon. There's a reminder of the sin of Hava. So why is it that water removes that? Because when the world was created, What does it say? V'ha'aretz hayta tohu vavohu, v'hoshech al pnei tehom, v'ruach Elohim merachefet al pnei hamayim. Which means, if we understand Bereshit, the world was choshech, there was darkness, but in addition to darkness, the world was covered completely by water. Then Hashem, of course, did the creative process that we see in the Sheshet Yemei Bereshit, culminating with man, creation of man, and the creation of Chava from Adam. Neither Adam or Chava were born from a previous human being. Even Chava was not born. The rib was taken, or the side was taken from Adam, and he created Chava from Adam. They were the only people in the history of man that did not require starting off directly in water. Every other human being born, how does you start? In utero. There's the uterus, there's the amniotic sac, and then there's the amniotic fluid. And that's what the baby lives in for 9.5 months until birth.
Wow. That's very profound.
So what happens when a person, because here we have, again, this is it doesn't mean a person sinned here. There's nothing sinful about a woman giving birth to a son or a daughter. There's nothing sinful about a woman having her menstrual cycle. There's nothing sinful necessarily about a woman having bleeding not within the time of her, okay? Now, some of these Tumah and Tara are a little bit connected to sin, like the Metzorah. The Metzorah is Motzi Shem Ra, a person who doesn't know how to speak properly, okay? And that's why, Badad Yeshev Michutz LaMachaneh. If the person doesn't know how to talk to people with their mouth, or they cause there to be machloket with their mouth, then they don't deserve to be sitting with other people. Badad yeshev michutz lamachaneh. Okay? So returning back to the water is going back to an environment where the world was created from, the entire world was created from water, and babies are born, like we said, in an environment of water. And what makes the water unique, why do you have to go under the water? Your whole body has to come into contact with the water, right? A woman goes to mikveh. Her whole body has to come into contact with the water. Every strand of her hair has to be in the water. Why? You return back to an environment that is inhospitable to life. If you stay underwater, you can't live. So you return back to a situation where, and even a baby, when a baby is born, very, very quickly, there's an amazing thing that happens. Anybody who's studied, an amazing thing, there's an immediate shift. Because what has to happen, it's almost like there's a switch that has to be thrown. For 9.5 months, all the oxygen needs, all the nutrition needs were obtained from the placenta through the umbilical cord into the baby. The baby doesn't breathe. The lungs are not functioning. Suddenly, when the baby comes into the world, what has to happen? It's almost like a switch has to be thrown. And the uterus over here, what happens? This no longer is allowing the baby to survive. And the baby has to then be able to breathe oxygen like everybody else. That's called the beginning of life. If God forbid the baby doesn't start breathing, not a good situation. And if the mother doesn't expel the placenta, not a good situation. Which means it's a very short-term arrangement that goes on there. And it's amazing if a person studies the biology of how it happens. Anyone who studies embryology, which means how children in utero grow, and all the things that happen, and how the tissues change, and all that kind of stuff, culminating in birth, and you don't believe in God after studying that, you're not studying the same science I'm studying. There's just no way. Everything has to be exactly on time. Things have to be next to each other. If they're not next to each other, the tissues don't develop properly. And the more we study, the more complicated it is. So we return back to an inhospitable environment because that's how life started. Meaning what? Something happened where there's a disconnection between you and God. Maybe related to sin, maybe not related to sin, at least not directly, but indirectly always related to sin. What sin? Adam and Hava. How does a person get a fresh start? By recognizing and going back to an environment that is inhospitable to life for a short period of time, and then coming out and being reborn. How it is today, okay, is a little different than it was back then. Now, how is it possible that a woman's body changed? I mean, biology is biology. It's completely possible. Okay, we have children in the time of the Torah that are able to give birth to children at a younger age than can be given today. Think about the maturity level of Shlomo. King Solomon became the king of the Jewish people at the age of 12. Think about yourself at the age of 12 years old. Could you have been the king of Israel? If God would have come to you and said, I'm going to give you anything you want, a 12-year-old would say, I want a computer, I want a bicycle, a smartphone. This is what a 12-year-old would say. What did Shlomo Melech say? Give me chokhmah. What 12-year-old says that? So there's been a change in the nature, and this has been studied, by the way. There are certain nutritional differences that in societies where there's nutritional deficit, women sometimes don't give birth until later, okay? And there's been a shifting of what's called menarche, which is when women first start their period. It's been shifted earlier because of improved nutrition. And our strengths and abilities are not like it was in the time of the Torah, in the time of in the time. So there's been changes to human beings, not big changes, okay? But there are changes that are environmental. Okay, I'm not saying genetic necessarily, but certainly environmental changes, okay? So when the Torah says 7 days, in those days there was 7 days. There was no bleeding. If there was bleeding beyond 7 days, that was not nidah, that was a category called zava, which was the third lady our parasha talks about. We mentioned the yoledet, we mentioned the nidah, and now we have something called zava. A zava is a woman that has bleeding from that place, not when she's nidah. So any bleeding beyond the 7 days, this is the Rambam's understanding, any bleeding beyond those 7 days, if she has bleeding on the 8th day, that's not nidah anymore. That is zava. If she bleeds for 3 days, one after another, then she's called zava gedolah. And that the Torah requires her to count 7 clean days. That is the only one. Remember, the yoledet doesn't have to count 7 clean days as far as the Torah is concerned, right? She can be bleeding all 7 days, and she's still bleeding on the 8th day and the 9th day and the 10th day. If she gave birth to a son, she can have relations with her husband. If she gave birth to the daughter, if she's bleeding on the 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, on the 14th day at night, she can have relations with her husband, right? So we see what happens, that she's able to be with her husband, even though she's still bleeding. This is not the halakha today, okay? We'll see why in a second. So the only one that has to count the 7 clean days is zava gedolah. Once the bleeding stops, she has to do something called hefsek tahara, which means she has to check herself to make sure there's no more blood. And then she counts 7 clean days. V'safrala, she counts for 7 days. And then after those 7 days, she goes to mikveh, and then she's tehora, and she could be with her husband. Maybe there was already a change in the nature a little bit. And also because the women wanted so much to give birth to children that were not tainted spiritually. And again, not that a person can't fix it if they're born that way, but the Gemara talks about 9 different categories of children that are born with some defect. Spiritual, not physical. And one of the defects is a child that's born of a woman that's nidah. When they had relations, she was nidah. I'll give you another one. If a man makes up his mind that he's going to divorce his wife, but in a bad way, he wants to have relations with her one more time, and she becomes pregnant from that, that child is spiritually damaged. It's called a ben gerusha. Because in his mind, he made up his mind he's going to divorce her. He had relations with her. That child was born already after in his mind he had made, even though there's no divorce. They're not divorced. He didn't give her the paper. That's called ben gerusha. Another example, a man and woman having relations, and he's thinking about another woman. That's also a spiritually damaged child. So there are 9 different categories. Now, that's not to say that the child can't fix. Everything can be fixed, but there's going to be more challenges that child has to overcome. 1 second, okay? So because Benot Yisrael were so holy, and they understood their responsibility of giving birth to the children of the next generation, right? Because the only reason we came out of Egypt because of Nashim Tzadkaniot, right? So what happened? Hechmiru al atzman. They were strict with themselves, and they treated any blood that they had as zahva gedola. Which means, the halakha, and this is the halakha for today, a woman, if she sees bleeding that is the size of a mustard seed, if it's during her period, or if it's not during her period, she has to have 7 clean days, which means she has to do hefsek tahara, and she has to have 7 clean days. I'm not going to get into the details of how many days she has to be. It's the minimum amount. Okay, we'll leave that alone. But 7 clean days, the women applied that to themselves for any bleeding that they have. Why? Because they didn't want there to be, God forbid, any confusion regarding nida and zava gedola. And that's why what we read about in the beginning of the parasha regarding Yoledet, if a woman gives birth to a child nowadays, this dam tohar that the Torah talks about, this is not the halakha. She has to stop bleeding, she has to count 7 clean days, and then she has to go to mikveh, and then she could be with her husband. This is very complicated. I'm trying to summarize it in a very, very short way, okay? But it's important to understand the terms that are being brought here. So there's a lot of things here that are of spiritual nature. And that's why it has a lot to do with the thoughts of the couple when they are together. And if they want to, again, I'm not saying that even if their thoughts are not whatever, we see that there's damage that can be caused. But the key is to have the proper thoughts of when the couple is together during that time. This way they can bring, shall we say, more perfected souls into the world. Yes?
Hawa able to have children before her
She
menstrual
did.
cycle?
She did. Cain and Hevel were born before she ate from the tree. They had relations. Cain and Hevel were born. But there was no concept of gestation, 9.5 months. No. It says, in the Gemara, it says, Adam and Hava, 2 people went onto the bed, and 4 people came off. Imagine that. But we're actually getting closer to the way it was. For many, many years, people didn't live so long.
Oh, right.
Now people are starting to live longer. That's been over the past 40, 50, 60 years. We doctors like to take credit for that, but it all comes from God. But, in the beginning of the 20th century, the average life expectancy for men was like 50. People commonly died when they were children. So we talked a little bit about the nidah. So we talked about the tumah, just so that we don't discriminate against just women. The parasha will mention something called a zav. Just like there's a zava for a woman, there's a zav for a man. Now there's a difference between a man and a woman regarding zav. The woman, when she's a zava, it's blood. The man, when he's a zav, it's not blood. It's not exactly the same thing as it comes out when he's having relations. But even when a man has relations, our parasha talks about the fact that a man who has relations with his wife, normal relations, he is tameh. He has to go to mikveh. In order to go to the temple, he has to go to the mikveh. So we see this concept with the relations is not just for men, it's when he has relations, he becomes tameh. Nowadays, we don't have a temple. Men can't go to mikveh. I mean, we don't make bracha when we go to mikveh. Unless you're a convert and you come and become a Jew, then you make a bracha. But there's no mitzvah from the Torah for a man to go to mikveh bazman hazeh. because we don't have Bet HaMikdash, we don't have a temple. So we can't get that closeness to God that requires the necessity for us to remove tumah from ourselves. Only a Kohen still has a vestige of that regarding coming into contact with a dead body or being inside a room with a dead Jewish body, right? That's still because the Kohen, as we'll learn in next week's parasha, in Emor, that they're not allowed to become Tamei Met. They can't purposely come and touch a dead body, okay? Except in certain circumstances, if a first-degree relative dies, we'll do that next week. But other than the Kohen, men, there's no, and then the Kohen doesn't go to mikveh either. Even if he comes in contact with a dead body, he doesn't go to mikveh. Okay? So while men can go to the mikveh, kol hakavod, to... I'm talking now, today's day and age.
If he comes in contact with a dead body, he doesn't have to go to the...
No. Men can go to mikveh for spiritual, improvement and cleansing. It's a person, if a person has relations with his wife and he wants to go to the mikveh to become tahor, kol hakavod, he could become tahor from relations. But if he came into contact with a dead body, just the mikveh alone doesn't work. He has to have para aduma. He has to have the ashes of the red heifer. But only women go to mikveh make a beracha, because this concept of tum'at nida continues on until today. The last section of the Mishnah is called Taharot. It's one of the most complicated sections of the Mishnah that there is. There are multiple masechtot. It's huge, and some of the Mishnayot, for instance, kelim, utensils, because utensils can also become tameh. There are 30 chapters in kelim of the Mishnah, which means there's a lot there. There's only one Gemara for Taharot, and that is Nida, because that is Bazman Hazeh. That even the time, is for nowadays. Okay, Metzorah, we know that's a person who gets a certain disease. But this disease is not a regular disease that I'm familiar with, and I've studied diseases that we know about. What made this disease unique, it didn't only affect the person, it affected his clothing, and it affected the walls of the house. There is no medical illness that I'm aware of nowadays, including leprosy, which we have nowadays, that affects a person's clothing and the walls of the house. So this is something that was unique in the time of the Torah. Baruch Adonai Olam, Amen ve'amen.